In this lesson, I'm going to focus on mindfulness and trauma. And to do that, I'm going to interview someone who specializes in this area. And that someone is David Treleavan, who has written a book titled Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness: Practices for Safe and Transformative Healing. And my interest in this topic is born of the fact that there are now some data to suggest that some people, in particular people who have survived major traumas in their lives, whether that's sexual abuse or other forms of interpersonal violence, who find that mindfulness, as it's generally taught, can increase their suffering, particularly in the context of a silent retreat. So as there are now many thousands of you who are using this app on a daily basis, I wanted to offer something that might serve as a reference point and a doorway to further resources, should you need them. So now I bring you David Treleavan. David, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So we're going to talk about mindfulness and trauma, and this is a topic I have just kind of stumbled upon. I'm not a trauma survivor myself that I'm aware of. I mean, I guess we all have minor traumas in life, but as far as big T trauma, I don't count myself among people who have something substantial to reckon with there. And, I know people who are survivors of trauma. I don't know many who have deep experience with mindfulness practice, but I have been hearing echoes and rumors of echoes of people who start a meditation practice, especially in the context of silent retreat, and discover to their real frustration and sometimes misplaced shame that meditation not only doesn't work for them, it seems to compound their suffering. I wanted to start a conversation with you about this because you have a lot of experience with this. You have a PhD in psychology where you focused in this area. So to start, perhaps just tell me about your meditation experience and how you came to focus on trauma.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Toronto and started meditating as a teenager, and it's always been an important part of my life. I love the practice, and I started taking it much more seriously in my 20s. And I think sat in maybe the same tradition that you practiced in, so the Insight and Vipassana tradition here in this case in Canada, but also in the US. I started to go on longer term retreats, and I ended up actually at the Forest Refuge at Insight Meditation Society in Barrie. I
Hmm.
was doing a longer retreat there, and something was happening. Yeah, I'm happy to get into more details, but basically something was happening where some images and fragments of memories were coming up, and I kept following the basic instructions, but I was finding that I was becoming more dysregulated. And when I'd go to a teacher and I'd ask them, "Hey, what's the move here?" And they'd say, just take it back to the cushion. And so, as you were just saying in the intro, is I was finding that applying the basic instructions was causing more dysregulation for me. And that opened up a whole inquiry for me when I ended up moving to California and was doing a doctoral degree here in psychology, and was talking to more and more people about this experience I had. And they kept pointing me to trauma, and which may be similar to you. I thought, well, I don't have necessarily a background in trauma. I wouldn't ascribe it to my own life, but found that the intersection was actually answering a lot of questions that I had about what was happening for me. And long story short, as I did a dissertation, it got videotaped, and it kind of went somewhat viral. And I put that in air quotes because as much as a dissertation on mindfulness and trauma can go viral.
Right.
But, I ended up getting a number of emails, hundreds over this year or two following, from people who were saying, "Hey, I'm having trouble at this intersection." And so it got me very curious about where can mindfulness meditation help someone who's struggling with trauma, and where can it actually hinder them? And so my basic task has been to really try to create a list of best practices for both practitioners but also teachers. So that's a start of where I'm focusing my energy these days.
So let's just back all the way up and define trauma. What do we mean by trauma in this case?
Well, I like to ascribe the mainstream definition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, is that trauma it's the most intense form of stress that we can experience. and it's an event, or it could be a series of events that involves exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation, and that can happen through directly experiencing the event ourselves or witnessing the event, or you could also by learning that the event occurred to someone close to us, like a family member. And then there's also this domain of repeated exposure. So I have a cousin now who's working as a paramedic, and we've been talking a lot more about traumatic stress and what it means to be exposed. So that's a base level definition, and then you and I could launch off into much longer conversation about how we define trauma, how that's happened historically. It's a really fascinating history, but that's what I would center here, is that it's a form. It's the most extreme form of stress that we can experience. And for some people, and it's important to acknowledge up front, this is a smaller percentage of people. Some studies say 5%, some say 8%. People will develop symptoms in the aftermath, which we call post-traumatic stress. And then we'll have a more stable diagnostic criteria, post-traumatic stress disorder, which most of your listeners will know. So it's really a spectrum. But what we're talking about here is someone who's continuing to re-experience an overwhelming event that they lived through, and it's causing them trouble.
And we should also acknowledge that there's a spectrum of responses to the same or at least similar real world events that, for whatever reason, some people are not traumatized by things that one would imagine were objectively traumatizing and would traumatize some significant percentage of people. So, there are people who live through war or civil wars or rapes or, just horrific experiences who don't acquire what we call PTSD at this point. And then there are people who really find it difficult to rebound from what would seem to be far lesser intrusions into their lives. There's a difference there, and one can't determine who one will be or who one has been on that spectrum. But there's the thing about meditation is that it is offered as a generic antidote to human suffering, right? So that anything that could ail you psychologically is, at least in principle, amenable to being alleviated, if not entirely canceled by the requisite level of meditative wisdom. That's certainly the promise, really the explicit promise one finds in Buddhism. And I count myself agnostic as to whether or not that promise makes sense. The analogy I go to here is to physical exercise. And we know that physical exercise is generically good for people. And we know that certain people can take it to an extraordinary level, and we have our Olympic athletes to show us, how far fitness can be taken. But whether any of us ever get to that level of mastery, we know that our physical well-being can generally be improved through exercise. And yet, depending on who you are and what sort of injuries you may have suffered in life, or what sort of disabilities you might have been born with, it's also true to say that not every exercise is appropriate for every person at every time. And so, push-ups are a great exercise, but if you have an injured shoulder, they're not so great. So I view really any specific practice of meditation that way, that, most of them will be good for most people most of the time, and yet they could certainly be contraindicated in any one's case, and hopefully in most cases there are workarounds even for that person. Does that analogy hold up with respect to trauma in your experience?
Yeah, I've heard you use that metaphor, and I think it's a great one. I think it works very well, because a huge punchline inside of the work I'm doing is that more is not necessarily better for a
Mm.
lot of meditators, and I think the exercise metaphor is a great one. And however, a lot of the people that I end up talking to have followed kind of a logical train of thought when you pull back and think about it, which goes something like this. We have 35 years of empirical research now that says mindfulness and meditation help with stress. Trauma is a form of stress. Therefore, anyone who's experiencing traumatic stress would benefit from the practice. And there's limited research on this so far, but in many ways it's true. A number of people, to your point around exercise, will benefit from the practice. And then there might be a handful of people who actually, as you're saying, they need specific modifications or instructions. So if we're sticking with this metaphor on exercise, maybe they need a little bit of physio, or they need to have some one-to-one time with someone that says, hey, move your shoulder like this. And so I'm really interested in the particular modifications that someone might need inside of a rigorous meditation practice that would enable them to get the benefits of practice. I'll just say one more thing here, quick, Sam, about you had said about trauma. This is a really important point, that there are people that will live through traumatic events that don't actually have symptoms of post traumatic stress. Again, we could have a huge conversation here about, well, how do we want to define trauma? And most of the people I work with, their jobs are not to define PTSD, but it's really to be in this basic question of, is the practice helping someone or is it hindering? And I think the easiest place to look is around the nervous system, which is a huge part of some of the symptoms of traumatic stress, is that someone has either too much arousal, too little arousal, and there's this base level called a window of tolerance where someone can practice. We could unpack that if you want, but I'm most interested in less, asking if someone, if the experience they had was traumatic, and more, is the practice that they're doing, whether it's the app that they're practicing or the guided meditation they're doing, is that creating more of a sense of stability, or is it actually spinning them out and landing them in more difficult material?
Well, yeah, this raises a concern around, what I would consider a kind of paradox of progress in meditation, because it's not that when meditation is working, which is to say when it's actually good for you, that it's one's career is of, a linear ascent toward greater and greater states of well-being, which is to say that it's possible to be living an examined life generally and using one or another technique of meditation to help with that, and to have new experiences that have a valence of unpleasantness. In the coarsest way, just beginning a practice can cause some people to be more aware of aspects of their minds that are unflattering, right? They can suddenly
Hmm.
become aware of how anxious they are around people. And it's not that they've become more anxious around people, although I think there are ways of practicing that can produce that effect. But one can't reasonably expect to just feel better and better and better all along the way. And so how would you advise someone to determine whether a practice is, in fact, not helping them or leading them in a direction that's not worth going?
I'm so glad we're talking about this up front, where I think some people can take the initial headlines that come out around this conversation and assume that the point of practice is about trying to be more comfortable or trying to somehow be more calm. And to me, actually the opposite of that. Where the practice is so useful is being able to stay present with greater and greater fluctuations of challenge and difficulty. And so to me, mindfulness and meditation practice is actually ideal for someone who's experienced trauma or is having symptoms of traumatic stress, because they can end up staying with either the sensations, the flashbacks over time. It's something that we need. And what I want to be clear about with you and the whole audience is that a trauma sensitive form of mindfulness and meditation isn't about trying to coddle people. It's not trying to make them comfortable. It's actually about giving them the opportunity to be with more challenge, more stress. And it's not about walking on eggshells. Actually, which is one of the, this could be a bigger conversation we could have, but this idea of safetyism, I think it was Jonathan Haidt's work around that we're
Hmm.
just trying to create this sense of safety for all. And I think there's a larger conversation here about the way that traumatic stress, there's this idea of concept creep, like that we're talking about it in looser and looser ways, which I don't think is helpful. So this is a lot to unpack here, but I just want to get away from the idea, first off, that somehow we should be just trying to get more comfortable. And we could talk about it here if you want, but there's a model that I've been using called the window of tolerance, which is a key kind of principle inside of a lot of trauma work, which answers your question: how would someone know whether their practice is, like, how would we know the difference of being with greater degrees of distress, or that we're sending someone into a state of re-traumatization? So the window of tolerance basically says it's a sweet spot between what you could call too much and too little, which is a principle we could apply in so many different ways. Like a classic one is a zone of proximal development. I think it's called Vygotsky and inside of education, which basically says, here with you and me in this conversation, If I was just throwing out random statistics and it was kind of chaotic energy, that's not going to help our conversation. But if it's just dull and boring, it's too little. And so we got to find that sweet spot. And you can apply this to arousal and the nervous system when it comes to trauma. And so that everyone has this baseline where there's going to be natural sympathetic and parasympathetic fluctuations of arousal all throughout our day. Now, that's normal, but what happens when it comes to post traumatic stress is that people are experiencing huge fluctuations in arousal, something known as dysregulated arousal. So they're outside of what's known as the window of tolerance. And where it gets interesting, and I break this down in the book, is well, how do we know the thresholds? So how would we know when we're coming close to the edge of our window and should back off, or when do we stick with it? There's some telltale signs. One is around cognitive processing. Like if your cognitive processing starts to become more disorganized, that could be a sign that you're approaching your window. Or if you're experiencing intrusive thoughts or excessive sweating, again, there's particular telltale signs that we can start to read, both as a practitioner or a teacher, that just puts a flag up for us and says, okay, this might be a moment to have a conversation with this person about how it's going for them inside of practice.
And how much of this is a concern specifically about intensive silent retreat, and how much applies to daily practice, even in increments of 10 minutes of a sort that I'm putting forward on the app?
I think it's much more, now this is more hearsay right now, but of all the people I've heard over the years, a lot of people will run into more difficulty on longer and intensive meditation retreats. So I think the smaller bite size meditations that you're offering on the app are in some ways much quote unquote safer, in that people don't have as much of a place to get into difficulty and challenge. At the same time, there is some emerging qualitative research that's just coming out of Brown University, where it's kind of the largest qualitative study around meditation related difficulties, and found that it was actually people who were also doing shorter term periods of practice who could run into difficulty, especially if there was some kind of latent trauma that was there to be revealed. And to this point, I mean, mindfulness, I just want to be clear up front that mindfulness, it doesn't cause trauma, but it will reveal it. And it is such a powerful practice technology skill to be offering people, which is why I'm really excited that you did this app. Is it's so essential right now in a variety of domains. But I do want to be clear that it's a practice that can reveal difficulty. It's like if you're asking someone to spend enough time in sensation in their mind, they will often eventually bump into places that they might have been avoiding.
And the work you reference at Brown, is that Willoughby Britton's work, or is she associated with it?
Yeah, that's right. It's
Yeah.
called the Varieties of Contemplative Experience for folks that want to look it up. And there's lots to say. I'm happy to talk more about Willoughby's research. There's a lot to say about it.
Yeah, yeah, she seems great. I've never met her, but I'm sure one day our paths will cross. But she's distinguished herself as being one of the first scientists who has been interested in mindfulness to focus on the negative experiences people have, very often in intensive practice.
Can I jump in on
So,
that, Sam, really
yeah,
quickly?
yeah.
She actually spent 10 years really looking at the positive effects of mindfulness and talks about her positivity bias as a researcher. It's a
Hmm.
fascinating story. And then there's a great video, if folks are interested, of her actually in dialogue with the Dalai Lama, bringing her research around adverse experiences. They were at the Mind and Life conference. And if you just Google Willoughby Britton and the Dalai Lama, they're having about a 20-minute dialogue about this. And I think it gets into a very interesting conversation about how do we appraise events. In the Buddhist literature, there's things like, let's say, the 7 factors of awakening, where they talk about, here are some different modulations you can make inside of practice. I'm bringing a trauma lens. You'll have your own lens. So I think this is also a really important piece about how do we actually appraise different events, whether they're more positive or negative.
Yeah, that's a point I often make, that you can have incredibly unpleasant and stressful experiences, which, because of the context in which you have them, you have a conceptual frame around them, which is positive, right? I mean, so again, I often use an intense workout as the model here. I mean, you're just,
Yeah.
the same symptoms that you experience at peak effort in the gym, if felt in the middle of the night upon being awakened from deep sleep, would be absolutely terrifying. Our thoughts about what we're experiencing, even retrospectively, how we value what was a bad experience, what we think the net result of a bad experience is for us, all of that matters and can really determine our suffering or lack thereof afterwards. Let's make this very practical. The usual instruction, I'm teaching many different aspects of the practice on this app, but the usual instruction and certainly the starting one is to close one's eyes and pay attention to the breath and to sensations in the body. And it sounds like for victims of certain kinds of trauma, that is likely to be a bad starting point. Do you have advice about how to practice basic mindfulness if one is a trauma survivor? I mean, and perhaps, think of the most relevant trauma that would make that contraindicated.
Yeah, it's a key jumping off point into the conversation about what would be the modifications. And straight up the top, one of the ones is working with anchors or objects. So typically we're choosing something like the breath as a way to stabilize our attention. And then when the not mind inevitably wanders into thought, a place that we can bring it back. And when I've heard your meditations, it's a natural place to start. And I think the breath is a very useful and powerful anchor. And a big part of trauma sensitive mindfulness and meditation practice is that people have a few different options of finding anchors or objects that work for them. And these are ones that you might have worked with, but the anchor of hearing sounds in one's environment can be a useful one, or it could be other sensations in the body. That could be the hands gently touching the legs, or if they're folded, touching each other. Again, the point is not to get too attached to the actual anchor that we're using. The whole point of the practice is in that moment to stabilize one's attention and focus, to gain some mental stability. And for some people who are struggling with traumatic stress, the breath actually won't be neutral. The sensations connected to the breath, our respiratory system is really connected to our sympathetic nervous system, which is so deeply activated with trauma. And so when you ask someone to pay focused attention to their breath, that can actually end up being a setup for them for what I talked about earlier around dysregulated arousal. And again, we don't want to get back to being so overly careful. That might be fine for someone to be working with it, but to give people a couple different options, try the sensations related to your hands, and to have them know that doesn't mean that they're a bad meditator, because which is where people take it often, but that
Mm.
we're having these different options. That's really where I'm coming from, and what I'm interested in is that we're giving people options that enable them still to gain the benefits of the practice.
Clearly, from the point of view of the practice, all of these objects of mindfulness are as good as any other. There's nothing magical about the breath, and certainly hearing or any other sensations in the body or one's visual field. It's just the quality of attention that one is training. So that's worth remembering. What about practicing metta? Is that ever contraindicated in your experience? It seems like apart from the wrinkle where it can be difficult to feel metta for oneself, or one can be asked to prematurely extend metta to one's traumatizers. I can imagine that would be a bad idea in certain cases. But the general practice of metta, is that something that you would ever tell someone to avoid?
No, I'm all for it. I don't have any, there's no empirical research that would suggest there's any contraindications. However, I think of metta, two things here. I think of metta as a concentration practice, first and foremost, but
Yeah.
then also one that's just incredibly helpful. But then to your point, I think this is where it all kind of pools around a subjective, person centered approach to when we're working with people. And here's a story that I heard. So, the week of the Kavanaugh hearings, where we had, Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford, that intensely polarizing week here in the US, there was actually a story that I think the National Sexual Assault hotline went up 301% in
Hmm.
terms of calls. It was an intensive week. And heard a story from someone who wrote me and said they went to their weekly meditation practice, and the teacher, who happened to be a man, said, "We're going to engage in some forgiveness practice today." And that was just not, it was a miss
Yeah,
for this person.
bad
So
timing.
yeah, not, it wasn't
Yeah.
the best move in the moment, but it broke a
Uh,
lot of trust.
uh,
And so to me, it's like, how are we offering, what is the context and the backdrop by which we're offering these powerful practices? And if we're trying to skip over something difficult, to your point, to be doing metta for someone who might have attacked you, if it was an interpersonal form of trauma and violence, that's a pretty advanced practice. But I'm not saying we don't want to get in that head in that direction. So no, I wouldn't say there's any contraindications, but just to be conscious and aware of when we're actually applying these different practices given this situation.
So there's a related concern I have, and I guess there may be a direct line from trauma to it, or maybe it stands alone. But obviously, the goal, certainly one of the primary goals of meditation, is to recognize that this self we spend a lot of time thinking we have is illusory, and to enjoy the benefit of cutting through it. And, I'm persuaded that that realization under one description is wholly beneficial, but it seems that there are pathological forms of destabilizing the sense of self. There's dissociative phenomenon that have a clinical description. I don't know how well they're understood in the East, but in the West, we do have a catalog of various ways in which the self can be either incompletely formed or undermined. So I'm wondering how you think of what really is the target of this practice. I mean, insight into anatta, the Pali word for selflessness, insight into emptiness, insight into non-duality. All of that can sound like a kind of depersonalization phenomenon in a Western sense. And a lot of the language one hears in an Eastern context, and which seems appropriate for those of us who have had this experience, talking about the dreamlike quality of phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
talking about mere appearances. I mean, all of this can sound like pathology in a Western context. I don't doubt that there are pathological versions that are kind of counterfeits to wisdom that can be precipitated through practice. How do you think about this?
I think you're naming such an important tension that comes up around this intersection of meditation and trauma. And I actually really appreciate, from having explored the app, the way that you talk about no self. I think it's very practical and grounded. But here's the tension as I see it, is that in some of the traditions that I've practiced in, primarily in, say, Theravadan or Insight tradition, taken to the extreme, this can involve even reporting that does not involve any kind of first person pronoun. So I was on a retreat once where we were doing the practice of, when I would report on my experience, I wouldn't be saying I. In the service really of anatta and this experience of no self, I would say something like, anger is being noticed versus I'm angry.
Right.
Which, I grew up, I'm a psychotherapist and spent a lot of time in therapy. So I'm so used to just being coddled there. Like, oh, I'm angry, and the person gets to be gentle with me in it. And it was so different for me. And I found it very difficult, but I found it also did head in this direction, as to you're talking about degrees of depersonalization in what felt like a helpful way. But then if you contrast that for a moment with work around trauma, a lot of people who have suffered trauma, especially interpersonal trauma, they might have, for good reason, really dissociated from themselves, their bodies, and their experience, and gotten away from an experience that was too much. And for some, a large part of trauma recovery work is really a reclaiming of the self and the body. So there's a practice inside of one trauma methodology I know, which involves taking a warm shower. This is for someone who might be very dissociated from their physical experience, and letting the warm water touch different parts of the body, and then actually claiming that part of the body as one's own. So say the water was hitting my arm, I might say, oh, this is my arm, and just letting the pleasant sensations be there. And I think that becomes a really important part of someone's path to recovery. But then, so to me, it's about gradations. And I'll just end with saying that Willoughby Britton talks a lot about this, about, well, where's the middle path around something like depersonalization? And she's talked about this in a number of different ways, actually inside of neuroscience as well, talking about the problem. I mean, the amygdala being a common example of, we often talk about it's useful when the amygdala is more reduced in intensity. It's often, broadcast in the literature. I think it's a positive thing. But then if it's taken too far, it results in blunted affect. So
Mm.
where's that sweet spot that we can find inside of practice that would head us in the direction of no self? Because I think that's very useful. but at the same time, meeting someone where they are at the beginning of their practice.
We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in reporting experience, I mean, so someone who reports the experience of, they can't get back to themselves, or that they're displaced in some way from their usual emotion and cognition. It's still, again, I should caveat this as I always do, that I'm not a clinician. I have no clinical experience. So I'm giving you my intuition about the way the mind works here. In those cases, as in virtually every other instance where somebody is describing their experience for better or worse, either they could be very, very happy or they could be very, very unhappy. They're spending most of their time identified with thought, right? Thought is the mechanism by which their suffering is being meted out to them. And again, at one point in my book, Waking Up, I described the opposite experience of somebody who clearly thought she was enlightened, and it had even been recognized by one of my teachers as the next Buddha. But when she was forced to take a very close look at her experience, she was thinking her enlightenment, moment by moment, and not noticing it. I mean, this was somebody
Right.
who actually did not have a lot of mindfulness, but just had an extraordinarily positive affect for a time, and was just thinking about how empty everything was and how expansive and how spacious.
Right.
And so people who are having, clinically significant experiences of depersonalization, say, I would imagine, are thinking about how nothing seems right, how scary things are, how thinking about specific changes in their experience, and and reading into all of that, more reasons to think anxiety producing thoughts. So I can float that hypothesis to you and then ask whether breaking one's identification with thought might also be the answer, even in that circumstance, as far as the answer to how to reduce immediate suffering. Or do you think that there are cases where noticing a thought as a thought is itself contraindicated?
It's a great question. And I think in what you're floating, I think you're touching on where mindfulness actually becomes the most important solve for someone's or a bomb inside of their trauma recovery work is the ability to recognize a thought for a thought and have some distance from it. Now, if I'm hearing you right with that description of that, that sounds like a pretty inflated place to be for a period of time, that there wasn't much distance from those thoughts. There wasn't a lot of mindfulness present.
I describe this person in, actually, I think this description's in the app as well. There's one lesson where I read this section from my book. But yeah, this was a woman. I don't know if you remember when H.W.L. Poonjaji was discovered in India. He was an Advaita Vedanta teacher, a disciple
Right.
of Ramana Maharshi,
Right.
who functioned like a tractor beam for a period of years there for Vipassana teachers and students at a pretty high level who were not entirely satisfied with their practice, because his message was the fairly bracing and uncompromising Advaita one, which is, if you're practicing at all, you're missing the point, right? There's no meditation to do. There's
Mhm.
nothing. You either get it or you don't. And he was an immensely charismatic person, but he would also, because his doctrine was really, consciousness is already perfectly enlightened. You just have to recognize it. He would more or less, sign off on the enlightenment of anyone who would just stand up in his presence and say, "I got it." And so, he certified me as an enlightened Buddha, and many of my friends, and he's,
Congratulations.
yeah. So he just didn't, whether he was dogmatic in this regard or he simply could not recognize that not everyone was as luminous as he was. He himself seemed so personally transfigured by his own practice or non-practice that it was, he was a great advertisement for what it might be like to be totally free of self. But it was also obvious to many of us that the people he was recognizing were occasionally floridly neurotic and not at all likely to be the next Buddha. But so in this case, he recognized this one woman who actually seemed quite remarkable in her level of happiness, and she didn't seem unbalanced at all. She seemed great, and she was certainly having a very positive experience. But as luck would have it, a bunch of us were going to study with a Dzogchen master in Nepal, Tuku Urgyen Rinpoche. So we were leaving Lucknow, and this woman asked if she could come with us, and, she was good company, so, why not? So she tagged along, and so it was just by sheer good luck that I saw this or the consequences of a different teaching here, and a mere 24 hours later, I'm sitting with this woman who had just been recognized by one of the most celebrated Advaita Vedanta teachers of our time as, a fully enlightened Mahasiddha. Now she's getting, the first day of instruction with Tulku Rinpoche, who's a great Dzogchen master, and she launches into her account of herself, of a sort that had won nothing but plaudits from Punjaji, saying, just how empty everything was and how non-dual awareness was. And she's just, connecting all the dots from a conceptual point of view. And Tulku Rinpoche is listening to this, and he said, okay, well, just tell me, how long has it been since you were lost in thought? And she said, oh, I haven't had a thought for at least a week. And so that this kind of barely survived translation. He's going back and forth with the translator and then he looks at her and he said, and he gave kind of a short laugh, and he said, oh, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're all just going to wait for you to have your next thought. So that's a room with like 30 people in it. We're literally halfway up a mountaintop at his hermitage in Nepal, all crammed into a little room. And, he's been on retreat for now something like 10 years. And he said, we're all very patient people. So you just, there's no rush. Just tell us when you have your next thought. And her enlightenment unraveled over the course of 30 seconds. She's just said, okay, wait. Okay, that might have been a thought.
Oh, no.
And it was unbelievable. I describe this as the most skillful moment of teaching I've ever witnessed, and it really was. So what I'm imagining in the case of many of these negative experiences people have of depersonalization, there's the analogous thing going on, that they're thinking all or certainly most of the time, and it is the undercurrent of thought that is delivering this destabilizing experience.
Yeah, I think it's a great story to illustrate that. And it makes me think in part around this issue that's been coming up more and more in conversations with people around compliance. And where is it? So I'm going to answer this in a sort of sideways way here, see what you think.
Mm.
That a number of the people that I've met now over the last 5 years describe being in an environment where they're following basic instructions to the best of their ability and end up feeling that, again, we get back to this, something's not working where they're paying attention to what's predominant. They're struggling. They're either identified with the re-experiencing of the trauma. They're basically stuck. But what I've noticed is that people will often end up experiencing, these are thoughts, but are feeling a sense of shame and isolation. Like here I am in this meditation environment. I look around. It seems like most people are having a more positive experience than I am. I
Yeah.
must be fundamentally broken on some level. And so what's the competence that someone in leadership, I mean, that's a brilliant example of leveraging somehow the community in that moment to have someone to unravel the enlightenment experience. But how can we go the opposite? What's the way that you'd work with someone who is just flailing inside of their experience, is overly identified with their thoughts, not getting any space or distance, and how to work with them in a way that gives them a path forward without leaving them shamed, to leave them with some resources going forward? That's mostly what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and I guess this is something I recommend at various points in the app, where there's certainly a time and a place for everything. And so, if someone is suffering, whether it's the consequences of prior trauma or just some really difficult experience in the present, I mean, just take bereavement, someone close to you has died.
Yeah.
I think it's certainly great to have mindfulness as a tool well in hand before that happens. I mean, that, it really can become an amazing antidote to suffering moment to moment. But whatever the level of one's practice, the most skillful thing to do in various moments might be just to pay attention to something else. I mean, just to go watch Game of Thrones or something, just to actually put your attention elsewhere, to bring your mind some pleasant distraction. I mean, that's part of the toolkit of modulating one's inner life. So it's not that a kind of relentless observation of the evidence of one's unhappiness is always what's called for, even in the context of a retreat. I mean, I would imagine there are people who you would recommend leave retreat or take a break from it or just, spend the day walking in the hills rather than sitting in the meditation hall. You have to be an increasingly intelligent curator of, your own conscious states, and mindfulness is not the only tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really what I've been advocating for with the book and the work, is to say that we need to have this diverse toolkit, not just to have meditation practice as some kind of blunt tool, which, I mean, Sam, this is not happening in your app. I mean, I'm speaking in many ways largely to folks that, do a weekend workshop in meditation and then end up teaching it the
Hmm.
next weekend, thinking, well, just this seems like a pretty simple instruction. Just, take it back, be mindful, be aware. And I'm trying to, in support of the proliferation of meditation right now, which I'm in support of, how do we get more complex and nuance to ensure that the practice can be as powerful as it would be? And I, where I'm digging in is to say, well, why are the reasons, particularly, that someone who's struggling with trauma might get into trouble? Like, where are the particular pitfalls? And then, to your point, what can we do about it? So, someone experiencing traumatic grief, maybe it's not the right time to be sitting. Now, a lot of meditation teachers, like we've worked with, they have that in their toolkit. They know that there might be times that it's best for someone just to take a walk instead of practicing, or practice in a different way. And so that's where I've been shining a light is, okay, well, what are the tools that we would need? And one question I was going to put back to you is a question that's been coming up is whether warning labels would be useful. I think this is a useful question around informed consent. Like, do we want to let people know that, hey, every once in a while, someone you might run into difficulty with this intensive practice? I'm not a proponent of a quote unquote warning label, but one thing I heard you do on one of your guided meditations, I think it was having some people look into the mirror, maybe, or it
Hmm.
was an impermanence. It was reflecting on death. But basically, you
Yeah.
spent the first 30 seconds saying, hey, there's times for this meditation. And I think you said, if you're experiencing XYZ, this might not be the best time. And if at any point this feels like too much, it's okay. I thought that was so skillful. I marked that down as there's just an embodied trauma sensitive practice. And I think that's happening more and more, but it's not yet integrated into the larger, I'd say, contemplative community. And
Mm.
that's the conversation I'm interested in having.
Yeah, no, I often offer a disclaimer when I talk about free will because I find that topic explored philosophically winds up, destabilizing some people. I hear from people who feel quite rattled by my analysis or any analysis that free will may not exist or may not be what it seems. So yeah, I mean, if you're that person who feels that any of this, whether it's a conceptual consideration of the nature of mind or the nature of reality, or it's any practice that's causing you to pay attention in a new way, if you feel that any of that is not good for you, you have to be the first and last judge of that. And
Yeah.
by all means, pull the brakes. So, as far as recommendations beyond the scope of this conversation, you have a book, Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, which has much more information in it. Is there anything else that you would recommend people seek out as a resource if they feel that trauma and all of its challenges are really something they have to sort out in order to even begin doing a practice?
Well, I think there's a couple other researchers doing work around this. One, her name is Trish Magyari, Magyari. So I'm by far in no way the only person doing work in this domain. And then a lot of, meditation communities. I don't know if you'd include yourself here, but in the Insight tradition, we have Spirit Rock. I'm here in California. There's a lot of communities that have been really exploring this intersection of meditation, trauma, healing. And so I'd say for if someone is experiencing, if they're taking your app and they're going through the program and they're having some experiences that feel, well, a little bit destabilizing, or they're in some questions about it, I think to ensure that they have reaching out to someone who they could work with who has at least some foundational competence around trauma. I think that can be very useful, again, as a way to be able to participate in doing the app. So I'm finding that just raising consciousness around the issue that, hey, it's not a panacea. It's not always going to work for everyone. It will work for the majority of people. And then not to be ashamed if it's not working. And then just exploring options. I'll have on my website next month, I'm going to be putting up a bunch of local practitioners, folks that people can work with. But just to be aware of not over applying the basic instructions, I think is the place to look, especially in this early stages.
Well, on that point of finding a practitioner, yeah, how would you recommend that someone find a psychotherapist or psychiatrist who has the relevant background in mindfulness to work with?
Yeah, I mean, they're sometimes few and far between, but I think the key, if you're looking for someone to work with, if that's accessible to you, is just to have, I mean, most mental health professionals will offer 15 to 30-minute free consultation. And that's a chance to ask questions and say,
Mm.
you can just ask really simple questions like, how do you think of the relationship between meditation and trauma? And just see if they've thought much about it, or who have they worked with? Can they give an example? There's so many questions that we can ask, and not to be afraid to ask questions and empower oneself. Because again, I think, to me, this whole reason I want to do this conversation is I'm a believer in the app and the teachings that are embedded inside of the Waking Up app. And I want people to be able to access it. And sometimes they might just need subtle tweaks that can come from an external resource like me, or from someone else that they can work with, again, so that they can come back and increase their ability to be with difficulty.
I really appreciate you taking the time to walk me through this. What's your website so that people can find it?
Yeah, sure. It's just my name, all one word. So it's davidtreleavan.com. So DAVIDT